In this ethnographic film, I will explore the story behind anti-Black rhetoric in Brazil, focusing on the why this is and sharing my own story through my family's experience. I do acknowledge that these experiences are one that I did not experience, as I do not identify as a Black Brazilian, specifically women. But I have seen firsthand much racism and discriminatory behaviors while being in Brazil, visiting my family. I also want to acknowledge my privilege and positionality of being able to share and have the resources to research this work. This idea came to me from the work of the film Savage Memory, a 2011 film sharing the story behind anthropology Bronislaw Malinowski through the point of view of his grandson Zachary Stewart. This documentary was a critique but also a memory shared by his grandson on his beliefs while also sharing the story of his own positionality. Today, I will be critiquing the country of Brazil and the history behind the colonization, while also amplifying my family's story. I also was cautious not to implement wrongdoings from anthropologist Margaret Mead, who is someone that has critiqued other people in all the wrong ways. Instead of appreciating other people's culture and respecting them, she exploits them to Western fascination through her own work. In various films, she says things like, I have people in Bali and I have people in Polynesia, claiming humans as her own objects, which they are not. In the picture shown, she is holding a stick with a cape thrown over her shoulders, and as she almost walks around with this cape and this cane, as she is a conqueror, as she owns all this land and all these people. To give some context, if you aren't familiar with the biggest country in Latin America, known as Brazil, which is known for its most beautiful beaches and party life, and big soccer culture, also is one of the homes of the deep-rooted colonial history of racial hierarchy, colorism, and anti-Blackness. The history behind these systemic issues is relevant to the internalization and generalization of racism that many Brazilians unknowingly experience. An experience that my adopted grandmother experienced. The woman who raised my mother, Alice, who I consider my grandma. A Black woman who worked as a domestic worker her whole life. She has worked for my family in Brazil specifically for 40 years. She first started working for my grandparents, raising my mother and her two brothers. Then she worked for my uncle for a short period of time. She would make food, clean the house, raise the kids. How is she able to raise someone else's family as well as her own? This was her only option for survival, and for survival for her own family. She is now 70, taking care of my 80-year-old great-aunt, cleaning and making food for her, refusing to retire, as this is all she knew how to do since she was dropped out of school to become a full-time domestic worker at the age of 13 years old. This reality is for many Black women in Brazil and is very common. And Black women are unknowingly getting born into a system of colonial racism and anti-Black rhetoric, as this is their only chance of survival. To give some reference to this idea, we have to look at background on why this cycle of racism is one of the hardest to break. The first descendants of colonizers wanted to enslave indigenous people for labor, while the missionaries wanted to convert indigenous people to Christianity. As indigenous people were already established, colonizers found it hard to control the inland. However, they established residency along the country's coast, creating control of the trade market. The Portuguese sought labor for their plantations, which transitioned from indigenous to African slavery in the second half of the 16th century, where the largest ports of receiving enslaved people were Salvador and Rio de Janeiro. Out of every nation in the world, Brazil enslaved the most Black people and heavily profited off the slave trade, boosting their economy. Enslaved Black people occupied the central role and responsibility in the labor of the land and the production of the wealth of the country, while white Brazilians did not work. Brazil became the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. However, to this day, some would argue otherwise, that 25,000 to 40,000 workers are still victims of conditions similar to slavery, and to this day, Brazil holds the most amount of black people outside of Africa. After the abolishing practices started to decrease to the modernization of agriculture, people started to migrate from rural areas to more popular cities. Throughout history and throughout time, physical features such as nose, hair, stature, body curves, cheekbones, and eye shape inform indigenous black versus white European ancestry and shape the ideal beauty standard that is seen throughout Brazil's media, which puts into effect on how people are treated. I remember when my mother told me a story about when my grandmother used to pinch my nose to make it thinner when I was a baby. When my mother caught her, she mentioned how she would also pinch my mother's nose when she was a baby. And when she was little, her and her sisters would walk around with clothing pins on their nose, emphasizing their natural nose and their indigenous nose was not acceptable to society. These generational cycles of beauty standards are ingrained in Brazilian families due to the deep roots of colonization embedded into young women's lifestyle and give anti-black narratives that is embedded blindly into the culture. To further my research, I would like to travel to Brazil and interview a handful of domestic workers throughout the more populated cities such as Rio and São Paulo. I would like to see their day-to-day life and not only go to their job, but what the dynamic is when they go home to their families, and share their experience and point of view on this topic. Getting a point of view from the families while also getting a point of view of when they're at work. This will allow me to share the issues that most black women in Brazil are facing due to the decades long of racism and poverty, as this ultimately is a battle of survival.